All right, man, peace. So the Atlanta Hawks of the NBA have been at the epicenter of some racial animus in the past. Danny Ferry, their former general manager, was accused of making some racial remarks or repeating some racial remarks pertaining to Mr. Luol Deng, which eventually led to him being removed from his seat as GM. In addition to some accusations by fans that the Atlanta Hawks cater too much to their quote-unquote African-American fan base. Now a former employee of the Atlanta Hawks, Ms. Margot Klein, is alleging that she has been the victim of some racial discrimination because she's a quote-unquote white woman. Anyway, they're going to talk about it. I'm going to chime in.
This is SportsCenter right now. I'm Antonieta Collins. A former Atlanta Hawks employee has filed a lawsuit against the team for alleged discrimination. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution reports Margot Klein claims Hawks External Affairs Director David Lee, quote, promoted a culture of discrimination against white people, especially white women. The lawsuit went on to say Lee would make jokes about white culture, as well as hiring and promoting black employees who Klein said were less qualified over white people.
Let me say this very quickly. If you're a so-called black man working in corporate America and you happen to get a managerial position or any type of position in upper management, do not make any racial jokes. Keep it entirely professional, because anything that you say can and will be used against you. I promise you that. Okay? Those people are not your friends. Oftentimes, so-called black men try to ingratiate themselves into corporate America by making many of these off-color racial jokes or gender jokes, trying to joke with women, joke with people of the other races. This is why I tell you brothers on this channel, do not joke with the females on your job. Do not joke with these so-called white people on your job. Just do your job to the best of your ability. And like I always state, really the so-called black man should be constantly trying to find a way to make money on his own without becoming grafted into the corporate framework, which is just a cult anyway. That's all corporate America is, a big cult. And a cesspool for confusion. I call it high school 2.0. A bunch of silly, depressed people running around trying to see how much confusion they can spread in other people's lives because they hate themselves and their job, for the most part. Now, I don't know how valid many of her claims are. There could be some credibility to what she's saying, because it is a possibility that her former manager, the so-called black man in question, was unprofessional. Who knows? Depends on how simple-minded he was or is. Either way, brothers, for you so-called black men who listen to my channel who happen to be working in corporate America, keep it professional, man. Keep it professional. Do not joke around, especially with these females on your job. Leave them alone. And when it comes to any type of humor pertaining to race, let them make the joke. You don't make the joke.
The team responded by denying the allegations, saying, quote, we take all claims of discrimination seriously and have performed a thorough review of these baseless claims. The case was quickly dismissed at the EEOC level. We deny these claims and will vigorously defend against them.
I don't know really how relevant it is that it was dismissed at any level, seeing as the Hawks are very cognizant of their near history pertaining to racial issues, claims of quote-unquote discrimination, as I've stated in the past, pertaining to Mr. Danny Ferry, as well as their fan base. And to be quite frank with you, this is just not good for their franchise. They've had some issues with ownership, and now they're having more issues with management. And as we know on the team level, they've been terrible this year.
Now, let's get it back to First Take.
The Hawks have an interesting situation here on their hands. Stephen A., what's your reaction to this former employee's complaints?
Well, my reaction is that I think the Atlanta Hawks as an organization have to be very, very careful about some of the storylines that they've been associated with. We have to take into consideration the mosaic that the Atlanta, that the city of Atlanta really, really is. You have folks, particularly African Americans, migrating from all over this country to live in the city of Atlanta. It is the ATL, and I'm here to tell you, it is lovely.
Stephen A. Smith must like trannies, because that's pretty much what Atlanta is known for. For him to extol the beauty of Atlanta, I mean, look, it's no disrespect. Every city has their beautiful aspects. But for the most part, Atlanta is known for trannies and strippers. So Stephen A. Smith is infatuated with one of the two or both. And when he talks about the mosaic, pretty much every NBA city is viewed as cosmopolitan. So essentially, basically every NBA city is a mosaic, meaning what? They have a variety of races that make up that city. That does not make Atlanta particularly special. Beyond that, let's stick to the topic at hand. The Caucasian female claims that she's been the victim of discrimination, Stephen A. Smith. It's going to have to be determined and evaluated based off of empirical data. Was she passed up for promotions? And her job record states that she has excelled to a greater degree than the people who were given the promotions that she was looking for? Can she prove that many of the people who were in power over her made discriminatory statements against Caucasians, particularly Caucasian women? Just because someone is a so-called black man does not mean that he is above misusing his power. And that's why I constantly harp on brothers who are in corporate America to please be aware and cognizant of the added pressure and the dynamics that will surround a so-called black man in power. Do not think that you're going to ingratiate yourselves with these various demographics by trying to appear as if you're overly outgoing or extroverted or you're a people person. That's not going to help you. Trying to pal around with these other races and make all these off-color jokes is only going to come back on you in the long run. Keep it as professional as possible. Remember a long time ago, I worked under a manager who happened to be a so-called black man, and he used to confide in me all the time about the bullshit that he had to deal with. And he told me, and I knew this already, but he stated to me that the number one demographic that gave him a hard time were so-called black women, which I already knew. Because when you're talking about the workforce, you're talking about a dynamic where titles are official. So when a person is your manager, meaning your head, someone who is there to instruct you, direct you in certain duties that they want you to perform, you have to listen to them. And I've addressed this in the past pertaining to the so-called black man as an authoritarian or as an authority figure. He's not respected in this society, and it starts from the home. That's why I state before so-called black people rant and rave about the police, ask yourself, why do you not feel like it is a viable option that our people investigate the possibility of having their own police force? You know why that will never be broached? Because so-called black people cannot envision black men, so-called black men, being the entity that is there to preside over their own community and establish code and conduct. And that trickles over into the corporate world, where when and if the so-called black man tries to excel, he's going to be met with opposition by all forces. So once again, brothers, just to bring it back home and get back to the point, be cognizant of how you interact with people in the workplace. Be very aware of how you interact with them, how you speak towards them, and how you allow them to speak towards you. It is a workplace. It's not a club. It's not a hangout. It's not a party. What you say, people will laugh at and giggle at, and then they'll run back to their desk or their cubicle and send off an email and say, hey, you got to watch this guy because I think that he may be a little quote unquote racist or a little bit off kilter.
Make no mistake about that. But in the same breath, you have a Hawks organization that even part of their ownership group felt were catering too much to the African American audience, to a point where, if you recall, we debated a couple of years ago, stuff that on the Jumbotron, the music that was being played, season ticket base needing to be built, and how they could go about the business of catering more towards white folks because they felt too much was aimed in the direction of catering to the African American audience.
The Atlanta Hawks have had an issue with attendance for many years now, going on 20 plus years. Why is that? Because Atlanta is a city where people have a lot of things that they can be doing rather than going to a basketball game. So oftentimes you will not see sellouts at the Atlanta Stadium or the Atlanta Coliseum, whatever the term is for where they play at, until the playoffs. They've had that problem for a very long time. They've tried to counteract that by courting the quote-unquote black dollar. And what that has done is it has alienated a large portion of their populace down there in Atlanta, because they're not really trying to build a great team. They're trying to build a cult of personality or an atmosphere around that team where we're going to associate the Atlanta Hawks with what Atlanta's known for, which is big booty strippers.
Everybody was saying, well, what the hell is the problem? You know, what's the problem with that? The problem is very, very simple. In terms of attendance, in terms of paraphernalia sales, and the business of basketball per se, they have strong support from the African-American community, but they needed to do something to cater more towards a white audience. This is what the ownership, a piece of their ownership group was stating. And so when we take that...
And that makes sense because as an owner, you're looking to maximize your dollar. Why would you only market to one demographic when you can market to everyone? I do believe that there is a racial dynamic and a racial issue overall with the Atlanta Hawks that they're going to have to deal with. I'm pretty sure that Margot Klein was very aware of the background behind a possible racially motivated lawsuit, and she sees it as being more viable than it would have been if she was in another organization, being able to prove these claims, because she does have precedent on her side. So we'll see what she's able to come up with.
Take that into consideration as a backdrop, looking at what has transpired with this organization in the past. And then we take something like this into consideration. Even though you have a piece of the ownership group that was saying we need to cater to white folks more, you know, basically what you're saying is we're not doing that nearly as much as we should. Somebody like Margot Klein, who filed this discrimination lawsuit, essentially is of the mindset she's basically epitomizing the fact that, you know what, some folks within the organization that may happen to be white, we may feel like we've been treated like second-class citizens, similar to what the white fan base of the Atlanta Hawks may actually feel in and of itself.
That's my point, sir. She's trying to make a correlation between racial precedent that has already been set associated with that team. And there's a way to maintain a level of hipness without feeling like you have to devolve into a franchise or an entity that's trying to court some of the lower elements to your stadium because you think that that's going to give you quote unquote street credibility or it's going to make you feel like you're at the forefront of pop culture. The Atlanta Hawks, they definitely have an issue. And if the owner was complaining about the alienation of Caucasian fans, it's because he's been getting sent thousands of emails. I promise you that. He's not saying that of his own accord. He's saying that because they most likely are losing money or their profit margin is not where they feel like it should be. And he's getting email upon email and phone call upon phone call from the Caucasian quote-unquote community in and around the Atlanta area. And they're telling him, look, we want to go to your games. We like the Hawks. We want to like the Hawks. But every time we go there, all we're hearing is stripper music. We don't want our kids sitting in the stadium and hearing all these words over the loudspeaker. So you have to do something about that.
And so when we think about it from that perspective, we have to take it seriously because clearly they have catered to a minority audience, and that has worked for them to some degree. But they felt that in the interest of business, there were things that they needed to do differently. It's something that they spoke about in the past, and I think it's something she's alluding to with this particular lawsuit. That's just my take on it.
And she's probably also alluding to a lack of decorum from that manager. Once again, brothers, I cannot stress this enough. When you're in the workplace, you have to act like you're about to go to war, man. You have to be very serious. And stay on your P's and Q's, especially the higher up the corporate ladder that you're trying to climb. Because that definitely is a dog and pony show. That corporate America world, that shit is no joke. It's like being a politician. So for you brothers who have that dream, I wish you luck. Like I stated, that brother who was my manager way back in the day, he used to tell me, yo, man, I get so many problems from these different people, and the group that give me the worst time are the black women. And I knew that already. That wasn't hard to figure out. And once again, that is a trickle over from the fact that the so-called black man has allowed himself to be diminished in his own household. That's why I always stress to you brothers to be very aware and cognizant of what type of woman you're impregnating, because that's going to have a trickle-down effect in more ways than you may understand or know.
This is a really interesting topic because there's a lot to unpack in it.
There's not that much to unpack, Max Kellerman, but we already know you're a super liberal Caucasian Jew, so I might as well pull out my violin right now and play for you.
In the first place, it relates to the idea of actually affirmative action and the fact that there's a double standard in race. Of course, there are racial...
No, this case really has nothing to do with affirmative action, but of course, you're going to help to promote the black victimization mentality because you reap the benefits of so-called black people believing that they're going to be perpetual victims and that they should be looking for handouts and sympathy from you.
Racial double standards. It began with slavery. That was a double standard.
This guy loves bringing up slavery. I can't stress this enough to you brothers that listen to my videos who may think that someone like a Max Kellerman is enlightened in some way because he likes to acknowledge slavery or quote-unquote black oppression. The reason why certain demographics love speaking about slavery and quote-unquote black oppression is because that is a backwards way of saying that I know you need my help, Negro. I mentioned this a long time ago. It truly is linked to the mentality of the white man's burden, that he's here to rationalize your plight. He's here to elevate you because you cannot elevate yourself. That's why people like him keep bringing up slavery. Everything out of his mouth whenever the topic becomes about race is pertaining to slavery. Now, is there a trickle-down effect from so-called slavery? Yes, there is a bit of a trickle-down effect. But the real trickle-down effect is the miseducation of the so-called black male and female in the school system, the Rockefeller Foundation-funded school system, more than anything else, and the lies that these young black boys and girls are being inundated with, and the mentality that he's trying to push right now, which is that it is his responsibility to raise you up out of the darkness into his light.
And we are still feeling the reverberations of slavery. And so
then go to your bank, take out all your money, and give it to the first homeless black man that you see. Right? When you see Billy Ray Valentine in the street, give him your money. Trade places with him.
When a group is underrepresented in higher education, in higher socioeconomic brackets, in positions of power, etc., and that underrepresentation is the direct result of the official policy of the government in the country in which they live, which is the case in this country. It is the result of the institution of slavery. And then Reconstruction, Jim Crow, we know the history, I hope. Then you address policies, or you enact policies that address it. And one of them was affirmative action, and that's controversial.
Well, the main reason why affirmative action is controversial is because it's part and parcel of the socialist program to force so-called black people into the mainstream. And this is what I tell a lot of so-called black people, and a lot of them don't understand it, or it really is an affront to them because they feel like the civil rights movement was all on the up and up. The civil rights movement was Marxist. And part and parcel to that were the socialist reforms of the mid to late 60s, what was known as, I believe, the Great Society, led by Mr. Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was a plant for the international bankers, believe it or not. And that was linked together with Martin Luther King, which is why they were able to get a lot done when Lyndon Baines Johnson came into the White House with Mr. Martin Luther King. And they were able to initiate things like affirmative action later on down the line, because they wanted to bring so-called black people more into the fold so that it would be easier to manipulate all races at once. That's truly what it was all about in the first place, so that they can craft a workforce that would be able to program people. That's why they wanted to have so-called black kids in school with so-called white kids, so that they could all be taught the same things. They could monitor and moderate what people were learning. That's the essential point. So whether you're a so-called black boy or black girl, or so-called Caucasian or so-called Hispanic or Asian or what have you, they don't have to worry about you learning something different. You're all going through the same programming.
Because when it comes down to the individual being affected by the policy, it really is a zero-sum game. Well, wait a minute. If among candidates that are similar, you're giving preference to the African-American candidate, then the white candidate says, well, I understand as a group they've been discriminated against, but here as an individual, I am being, my freedom is being trod upon. And
I don't think that the issue is freedom. I think that the debate or the objection for many Caucasians to affirmative action is their belief that it's not merit-based. That that as they say, quote unquote, two wrongs don't make a right. Now, let me say this about affirmative action. What it stops is it stops so-called black people from coming together and figuring out their own problems. See, when it's like a stray dog that is in an alley and is trying to find something to eat. A person can see a stray dog in that alley and, feed it garbage, and you could lead it back to your home, and the dog will become dependent on you for sustenance and not even understand that it's been eating garbage, because garbage is better than nothing. But if you were to leave that stray dog alone, who knows? It might figure out a way to feed itself with healthier food. Point being is this: it's been 50 years since many of the civil rights enactments. And even though our people may have more of a voice now, the mental oppression is just as bad as many of the racial dynamics, the race-based laws of the 30s, 40s, and 50s that were utilized to separate people, but also force so-called black people to depend more on each other. So ever since the civil rights movement, it has led to a divide amongst so-called black people that may not have been there in the same way prior to it. The point being is this: this society is heading on a very steep decline from a monetary perspective, from an overall societal perspective. And the so-called black man is going to be confronted with the reality that in order for you to partake in this society, they're going to ask you to make certain allegiances in exchange for some of the benefits, quote unquote, that they have given you over the past 50 years. Allegedly. They already want you to think that you should be confederate with homosexuals and lesbians because supposedly, allegedly, we all have the same enemies. They want you to think of being a so-called black man as being synchronous with being a homosexual or lesbian. Why is that? Because what they're telling you is that you should intrinsically look at yourself as a degenerate and just lucky to be alive. Okay? That's part of the tricknology of this society. That's why I state that, yes, the Jim Crow laws were heinous, quote unquote, from our perspective, because we're not in a land, we're not in a time period of rulership. We're in a time to be ruled over until we finally throw off those shackles. But that's going to have to come from within you. You can't look at them to liberate you or free you. And that comes back to the point that I made about people like a Max Kellerman with the white man's burden mentality. That's why he always brings up slavery, because he always wants to remind you, so-called black man, that you were a slave. Even though, as I've already stated incessantly on this channel, the term and the word slave was used in reference to Caucasians, not to you. So why does he always bring that up for? I guarantee you, if the educational system was reformed, he'd be one of the first people to come against it. If so-called black history was not centered around slavery, he'd be one of the first people to try to come against it, because he understands the power of mental empowerment. He understands that. So you have to be very careful with how you allow people to speak to you about you. You have to be self-defined. You have to know your own history. You have to write your own history. You cannot allow someone else to write your history. That's why people get so upset and they claim that everyone who does not accept the conventional version of history must be a quote-unquote Afrocentrist. And I tell people who are not so-called black, especially non-black men who try to come on my site and engage in that back and forth, no, there's not going to be any racial circular conversations here. Why is that? Because I don't care about you. I'm not interested in your nonsense. I'm just not. I'm not a sadist. I'm not anything like that where I don't care about another human being. But I understand the motivation behind a quote-unquote non-black person trying to engage in that conversation. it's more about them than me. Yes, they're concerned about a so-called black man who's self-defined and self-validated. They're concerned about trying to squash that mentality. But number one is their concern about themselves and the feeling that they have to get a lot of this energy off their chest, that negative, hateful energy that they have essentially and intrinsically for the so-called black man, that they have to express whenever they hear one speak that is not dependent on being accepted by them. That really bothers them when they see that you don't care whether they accept you or not.
I also do understand how that feels for the individual. Nevertheless, I would say as a policy, affirmative action or something like it is necessary, because the bottom line is the playing field is uneven, and it is a direct result of the official policies of this government, which were toward African Americans, monstrous. Okay.
Let me say this also in regards to things like Jim Crow. Jim Crow was actually modeled off of many of the policies that were utilized during the Middle Ages when so-called black people were ruling over the Caucasian. And I'm sure that certain people are going to try to jump in the comments, what are you talking about, blah, blah, blah. That's a whole other video for another day. But once again, many of the policies and the actions that were performed, drawn up, legislated by Caucasians from the late 1800s all the way through the 1950s, early 60s, were directly correlated and a result of, and really just an inverted form of, many of the laws and codes that were used by so-called black people over Caucasians during the Middle Ages.
Okay, now we get into this. This is not exactly that, though. It's related to it, but it's not exactly that, because here a white employee is claiming that this is not some kind of coherent policy or government policy that's favoring some employees of similar caliber to me over me as a result of race, and I don't like the way that feels. No, I'm in a specific organization where people in positions of power are making decisions that exclude me based on race. Now, we don't know if any of this is true, but this is the claim. And if the claim is true, then I think she has a case. In other words, if the claim is that people in positions of power are saying you will not advance because of your race or your gender, well, that's not affirmative action, even though I understand why it could be perceived as something akin to it. After all, it's a zero-sum game, right?
Well, Max Kellerman, you were the only person who mentioned affirmative action. She stated nothing about that. So, once again, this is why when I started to remark on his statements, it was very clear that the only reason why he even utilized the tactic of mentioning affirmative action is so that he can go on his super liberal Caucasian Jewish spiel, his quote-unquote white guilt spiel pertaining to how so-called black people are deserving of preferential treatment in particular cases because of what was done to us during slavery. Once again, brothers, people like him bring up slavery all the time so that he can always remind the so-called black man of where they're from. Pretty much once again, like finding a stray dog in an alley. I can feed this stray dog whatever I like because he was left for dead. So he should be thankful to me. This is the white man's burden. That is Max Kellerman's angle. He's on the white man's burden platform. Please understand that.
Here are candidates. I'm going to give preference to one candidate based on race. So I don't think this is that quite. I understand why it feels like it a bit. And I would also say the larger...
You would understand why it feels like it a bit. Feels like it a bit to who? Do you? Max Kellerman is speaking as if he's advocating for the viability of a certain platform or of a certain constituency that doesn't exist other than in his own mind. There's nowhere here in any of these statements in this lawsuit where the female claims affirmative action had anything to do with the issue at hand. She's talking about discrimination.
Larger issue, hey, wait a minute, there's a double standard in race. You're damn right there is. And there always has been in this country, and the double standard has by so far favored white people for so long that when the double standard is applied in a way that tries to somewhat balance the playing field...
Let's read what it says. It says Margot Klein, a white female, quote-unquote white female, She claims that External Affairs Director promoted discrimination against white people, especially white women. Well, when you look at that statement, what that particularly seems to imply is that Miss Margot Klein is alleging that so-called black women were receiving preferential treatment by the External Affairs Director over white women. So there are implications of both race and gender issues in that department. And then, of course, you have the female issue of jealousy. As I tell you brothers all the time, jealousy is a major issue, as well as boredom, with the modern day female. They are galvanized by those two main emotions of boredom and jealousy. And whenever you have an excessive amount of females in the workplace, there are going to be a lot of issues there because of that. Says here that the organization ignored complaints and pressured white co-workers not to speak to her. So according to her, the organization seemed to scrutinize her, highlight her as a shit starter, and did not want her white colleagues to speak to her because they did not want them to be influenced by a lot of her rhetoric. So we'll see how true that is later on.
Well, you know, people don't like it who are affected negatively by it, but we have to understand it in the context of our history.
Well, I'll let you go, but let me say this. I think this is a good thing in this sense. It shows that the notion of equality in the workplace isn't such a radical idea. It's something that should exist everywhere.
Well, equality is never going to exist anywhere. That's not truly a realistic appraisal of the situation. There's really no such thing as equality. What life is really about is usability. What can you be used for? If you don't have any usefulness, then you have no relevance. That's what it's truly about. It's not about equality, because equality, essentially, according to an idealistic model, would state that I should be here because I'm just as good as you because I have 2 arms and 2 legs. That's the idealistic model. But when we go by viability or usability, is predicated on what can you do for me. That's why you were hired. That's what's known as merit-based hiring practices. Now, because you have to be subjected to the protocol, the paradigm of being interviewed by other people. Of course, race may be an issue. Your looks may be an issue. Your weight may be an issue. There are myriad of things that people are evaluating you by just off of the exterior. Your cleanliness, how you dress, etc. So there's never going to be any such thing as equality. But what you have to hope for is that a person is objective enough to understand your possible usefulness. Once again, that's all it's about, especially when you're working for someone else. How useful are you going to be to that organization? It's not about equality. And brothers get inundated with that. And that stops you from having a ruling class mentality, brothers. And that also falls into that Mr. Nice Guy paradigm that the so-called black man, that he gets subjected to make him think that he's supposed to allow all these different forces into his life just because. You have to always know why you're allowing someone into your life. And you have to always evaluate why this person is allowed to stay in your life. What are they bringing to the table? Because someone is either bringing something to the table or they're taking something off your table. So you have to figure out why the hell this person is here. And that's what reality is about. Reality is not about no damn equality. It's about usefulness.
If you look at throughout the 4 major sports, what she's speaking about essentially is what may exist on the part of black folks throughout various sports front offices. No matter where you go, Major League Baseball, hockey, NBA, NFL, etc., etc. When you look at the front offices that exist, the decision makers, those who are really, really calling the shots, it's predominantly white. And so now we find a situation where in Atlanta, you may have more of a black presence than may exist almost anywhere else. And you find a white individual whose complaints may actually be very, very legitimate, except you're not going to hear but so much sympathy emanating from minority communities.
That's not relevant. Really, who cares about sympathy? when she's going before a court of law, the court of law is not going to take into account how much sympathy she's getting from any type of exterior element, Stephen A. Smith. What you're saying is not relevant, bro. But, you know, this is, once again, brothers, this is the problem that we have here. We have too many emotional ass niggas trying to act as if they're going to represent the overall quote-unquote black collective. A lot of these niggas out here, they think like bitches, man. I'm just going to be real with you. It's a major problem. Major problem. The case is very simple. Miss Margot Klein is either going to be able to prove that she was discriminated against because she was a Caucasian female, or she's not. It's not going to matter about any type of outside esteem or how her case is viewed by the black people of Atlanta. Who gives a shit? I mean, really, it's all about power. You either have it or you don't. But the main point of me making this video, once again, is to harp on brothers being aware of what they're doing in the workplace, especially when and if you get to a managerial position. Do not allow yourself to fall into this dynamic where you're joking around with people about race. All right. I mean, there were certain topics that I would not address in the workplace when I worked in corporate America. Race, gender, sexuality, religion. Those were 4 big ones. When people try to get you into those type of conversations, you tell them have a nice day.
Because in our eyes, it's nothing foreign to us. It's something that we deal with every day. But it doesn't dilute or minimize the importance of the argument she's making, particularly taking into consideration the Atlanta Hawks organization and some of the things that it's been through in recent memory.
The issue, Stephen A., I think, is how do we define equality? Does equality...
Well, the reason why, Mr. Will Kane, why you feel compelled to ask that question is because you most likely sense the same thing that I do, which is that equality is just a buzz term that is used to push Marxism. That's it. That term is used to push Marxism in a cloaked way.
Equality mean, as Max pointed out, correcting for historical ills, or does equality mean giving everyone an equal playing field in terms of individual opportunity?
The latter.
But I agree. It is the latter.
Well, it's supposed to be the latter. Well, we all know that that's really not viable either. But at least you're making a better point. There's no way that you're ever going to be able to offset those quote-unquote historical ills, as you state, because Will Kane understands, as I already stated, that if people were truly sincere about offsetting slavery, then they would go to their bank account and empty their bank account. That's what they would do. So Max Kellerman is just full of hot air.
And just quickly here, we're not going to have a ton of time for you guys to respond. Max, I think you did a great job. The bottom line is when you hear the word discrimination, a lot of people's brains just buzz out like discrimination, automatically something is wrong here. The truth of the matter is discrimination in and of itself is not a problem. It's what kind of discrimination and what reason do you have for it. Even race-based discrimination in this country, as you point out, affirmative action is race-based discrimination, but it has a reason given by the government. It has a reason for its existence.
Well,
this situation, if I may, this situation does not appear to be one about affirmative action.
Thank you, sir. And it never did. All that was a buzz term to be utilized by Mr. Max Kellerman to go on his spiel. Thank you, sir.
This seems to be an individual who is claiming.
I agree.
Who is claiming.
Well, if you agree, Max Kellerman, then why did you bring it up in the first place? You know why you brought it up? Because you had nothing tangible or credible to state about this issue. You didn't have anything really to say to fill up your airtime. So you had to go on this rant pertaining to affirmative action and why it's necessary.
They are directly and individually being punished for their race.
I agree. I think we agree about that. If the claims are true, it's not okay. I will say this about affirmative action, Will. The idea that because these horrendous crimes against humanity were directed at really crimes against Africans and African Americans throughout a large part of the history of this country, and they're still being felt today, the idea that, well, everyone needs to be treated fairly, and therefore, if in trying to level the playing field, we treat African Americans more fairly, aren't we treating white people less fairly?
Well, there's no such thing as more fairly or less fairly, Max Kellerman. You're making up terminology. You're either being treated fair or you're not. Fair essentially means that you're getting what you deserve. As I've already stated in another video series, you get what you deserve based off of what you demand. So-called black people have not learned how to get what they deserve because they don't know what they should be demanding, particularly so-called black men, because the so-called black men have taken on the mentality. And when I say so-called black men, obviously I don't mean every brother, but I mean the overall mentality that is imbued upon so-called black men is based off of feminine energy because they've been dominated by their mothers. So the woman, by nature, is always going to look towards who's in power. Because no matter how much they talk, women know that they're not supposed to be leading. So what they like to do is to disrupt the status quo, but never to fully turn it over, because when full chaos has ensued, the woman's not going to know what to do. She just likes to promote chaos while there's order. That mentality, that energy, that spirit has been put onto the so-called black man by his mother through the matriarchy that has been instilled in the so-called black community since the civil rights movement. So that's the real problem, is that the so-called black man does not know what he should want because he's being taught by his mother. He has to be shown what he's supposed to be looking for, which is rulership, not equality. Rulership, not equality. Okay? And that starts through being properly educated, properly informed, properly motivated. Now you understand what type of woman you should be looking for, what type of relationship you should be in, what to teach your children, how to administer, how to rule. These are all things that are sequential, but you have to have the right mindset first.
That ignores white privilege. In other words, it's not just that African Americans are being disadvantaged by the ongoing reverberations of institutional racism, but that because we are comparing racial groups, and in that case it would be a zero-sum game, it's not just that the African American population is being disadvantaged, it's that white people are being advantaged in ways that are not always easy for white people to see. Right. And so the idea that you can just kind of...
Yeah, that's known as rulership, Max Kellerman. Let me say this, and I may lose a lot of so-called black people with this, but that's okay. There's no such thing as white privilege. All right? There's no such thing as white privilege. It's known as rulership. When you're in rule, you give preferential treatment towards your own. So the real issue is not white privilege. The real issue is that so-called black people do not have a ruling class mentality. You don't know how to rule. So you're looking at those in rulership and you're upset because one of the company lines of this society is that, quote unquote, everybody's equal. Well, you've been told that so that you can stay at a certain level of complacency. But that's a you problem. That's not a them problem. That's a you problem. You have to understand that you're being told certain things so that you can remain complacent. You're being fed garbage so that you can keep following that person home who found you in the alleyway.
Confine the injustice to some time in the past and say, well, the way to address that is certainly not to discriminate against white people, is to ignore the fact that black people are being discriminated against in ways that are difficult to see at times, but that it persists and therefore inequality persists.
We're not having an affirmative action debate right now. Trust me, we could go on for a half hour about those concepts you just laid out in affirmative action, but I have to go because we can still talk about, and we need to talk about this,
No, we don't need to talk about anything else, Mr. Wilcan. We've spoken enough. But anyway, brothers, once again, when we start talking about discrimination, particularly when you're in the corporate world, when you enter into the corporate environment, you're supposed to be essentially colorblind. Okay? The only time that race should become an issue for you when deciding who you're going to bring on or who you're going to hire is when both candidates are equal and you can get away with it. Just being real with you. When you make a practice of hiring so-called black people just because they're black over people of other races who are more qualified, it's only going to show in your record, because they're going to look at you and evaluate you and determine that this person is not qualified for their job. Now, when you start to make distinctions between two candidates, a so-called black person and someone of another race, and everything is equal, then yeah, you pick the so-called black person. That's what you're supposed to do. But when you just start picking Negroes just to pick Negroes, it's only going to show in your evaluation down the line. But anyway, peace.